Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed, except horrible tweets from our former president, or on the evening news, has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
So, if you had been selected to read poetry at a presidential inauguration when you were 22 years old, what president would it have been?
It would have been W.
Oh, well, we're stuck in the same deal because mine would have been HW, George H.W. Bush in 88, which would have sucked for me and for him. I mean, I went back and looked at, I have a journal entry I remember of like bemoaning the disaster of the George H.W. Bush presidency, which seems like it wouldn't have been such a disaster. Like he's now a like guy like, well, why can't the Republicans be more like him?
Well, on the other hand, you would have been the perfect writer to speak at the George H.W. Bush inauguration, you waspy white guy, Midwestern Princeton graduate.
That's right. I was at Princeton when he was elected, and I wrote that in like the biology library where I worked to make money. Yeah, and those are the people who voted for Bush, which is why it was cool to see Amanda Gorman, who's the woman that we're talking about, read her completely badass poem at Biden's inauguration, because not only is she way better at poetry than I was when I was 22 or will ever be, she also represents two of the most important groups that went for the Biden-Harris ticket in the last election, Black voters and women.
Which is why in today's episode, which we're recording the weekend after the inauguration, we want to talk about what those two groups of voters hope to see from the new administration in terms of policy. In the second half of the show, we'll be talking about this with Kawhi Strong Washburn, as well as about his debut novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors. But first, we're excited to talk to former poet laureate and current all-around great person, Tracy K. Smith. Tracy is the two-time poet laureate of the United States and author of The Body's Question, winner of the Kavikanem Poetry Prize, Duende, winner of the James Laughlin Award of the Academy of American Poets, and Life on Mars, winner of the 2012 Pulitzer Prize. Her memoir, Ordinary Light, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and her most recent collection, Wade in the Water, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Prize and came out in 2018. She teaches creative writing at Princeton University. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with an essay you wrote about Kamala Harris back in October, and I wonder if you'd read that to us.
Sure, absolutely. Pull it up. In the months since the killing of George Floyd, I've been stirred by the many statements of determination that have arisen out of the movement for racial justice in America. One call is for institutions and communities to do more to hear and heed the perspectives of Black people and people of color in their midst. These voices and perspectives, our voices, our perspectives, are key to harvesting the many opportunities alive within American democracy. But our nation must do the work of drawing near and listening. When the news reached me in August that Senator Kamala Harris had been selected as Joe Biden's running mate, it struck me that the Democratic Party was ready to listen and to learn. Harris's courage, brilliance, energy, and her decades of experience have long qualified her to help lead America forward out of our current national moment. And her perspective as a woman of color is critical to doing the work of helping all of us heal from the strife of racism and racial division. Knowing that Harris's voice will be central to this dialogue makes me believe that our American Union can be strengthened and deepened. As Attorney General of California, Harris secured a $20 billion settlement for California homeowners faced with predatory lending. She created the Open Justice Database, which made criminal justice data accessible and transparent to the public. As a senator, she has held politicians to an exacting standard of accountability. She's also shown us that leadership is not static, that it requires a willingness to evolve and to meet ever-changing circumstances with the capacity to adapt and to grow. These are the capacities by which nations not only survive, but become stronger, wiser, and more just. These are the capacities we need in our particular moment in human history. But history affirms that the work of speaking up can be difficult, even dangerous. It has never been easy for Black women to lead in America. Those who have done so have endured great resistance and even great personal risk. Unfounded as they are, today's partisan attacks against Harris belong to an age-old tradition of threat and intimidation designed to silence and distort voices of truth and dissent. But I'm firm in my certainty that American democracy continues to stand because of the sustaining work of Black women like Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, Kamala Harris, and the host of others who've met the demands of their time with a selfless willingness to further the project of freedom and progress.
Thank you very much. I really love that list of heroic Black American women at the end of that passage. And I'm sure there are many more people you would put on that list if Vogue hadn't given you a word count.
Absolutely.
For instance, Stacey Abrams, who, though you didn't know this when you wrote the essay, would be a crucial figure in giving the Biden-Harris administration a win in Georgia and electing 2 Democratic senators from that state.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the list, even as I imagine it, extends beyond people who hold political office to people who are doing that work in the spaces that they occupy. You know, I could imagine adding the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement to that list and many others, of course, too.
And you say at the top of the essay that our institution and communities have to, and I'm quoting here, do more to heed the perspectives of Black people and people of color in their midst. I think that's always been true just in terms of morality and social justice. But leaders like Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams are now real power brokers in the Democratic Party, and voters of color were crucial to Biden's primary and his victory in the election. And so Democrats really can't win elections without those voting blocks. So what should Joe Biden and Kamala Harris be doing in practical terms to heed the perspectives of Black people and people of color?
Well, I like a lot of what Biden and Harris are proposing, thinking about raising the minimum wage, taking COVID seriously as a nation, rethinking police oversight and accountability. But I'm also really serious when I say listening is something that's important. I think that leaders of every kind of institution have to make some kind of priority to sit down and listen to the people who have long been misunderstood or ignored. I imagine something like a listening tour of America, where leaders go into spaces and communities where Black and Brown people live, and letting those voices shed light on some of the policy concerns that are important. I feel like our vocabulary as a nation can't change in adequate ways if we're not drawing upon actual people's voices, stories, and the urgencies that characterize their lives.
I feel like that minimum wage is going to be a big deal. Like, I think that maybe that's being underplayed, but I really feel like it's going to, so many people have to work and live barely surviving, and making almost double in some cases seems like it would be really helpful.
It would. And I mean, what's also kind of shocking is how great the distance still will be between somebody who's making $15 an hour and what we imagine life in this nation is supposed to feel like.
Yeah.
I love that idea of a listening tour. And it just strikes me. I was earlier in a meeting with a bunch of other activists and was missing very much the energy and trust building of in-person meetings. And just thinking about, I mean, of all the reasons that the GOP and the Trump administration had to not take COVID seriously. I mean, we literally can't we can't meet in person, which is a way of organizing.
Maybe there could also be some listening from the media. Do you remember how right after Trump was elected, there was there were so many that it became a joke that, oh, here's a Trump person in a diner that we're going to interview and find out what they're really thinking and why they elected this man. But, communities of color and women of color could also be interviewed in states where and ask why did they care about this election? Why did they vote for Biden Harris? I haven't seen that piece.
And I wonder what a piece would look like that brings people who have different perspectives, who voted differently, together into a space that's not combative. That's not a platform for talking in sound bites, about the opinions that have been bolstered by social media. But like, what does your day look like? What are you worried about, or what are you looking forward to in the coming 6 months? Somehow that kind of bridge building is also going to be critical, right? To whether or not we're able to move forward as a union.
Well, and you did something like that. I mean, we're going to talk about that later with your anthology, American Journal. But I want to talk right now about something a little bit more, less, you may possibly unifying, but the question of accountability that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with. 8 senators and 139 congressional representatives voted against certifying the results of the 2020 election, including my senator here in Missouri, Josh Lovely Man Hawley. The Senate is going to vote on Trump's impeachment. Representative Mickey Sherrill has said that members of Congress led some of the insurrectionists through the Capitol for reconnaissance before the actual storming of the Capitol. But Biden has been notably distant from the impeachment push and wary of the idea that his administration should prosecute Trump. So what do you think is the right approach from the point of view of these important constituencies we've been discussing?
Well, I can understand why, as a candidate, he was distancing himself from that conversation. But I hope that he gets a little bit closer to it. I also hope the Senate does impeach him, because it really is a way of saying never again. We're not going to play this foolish game of lies and power and some fantasy of conspiracy again. We're past it. I don't know how realistic that hope is. But when I think about reconciliation in other contexts, other nations like South Africa or Rwanda, it seems like it's both been about naming in transparent language the sins, the wrongs, the crimes. I think it's also been about allowing the aggressors to acknowledge their complicity in these awful things, and then take the really interesting step of learning to forgive themselves, maybe even making that process public when it's happened. I've been moved by, I think maybe it was a New York Times Magazine article that I read years ago about this process in Rwanda, where, of course, it was neighbors who were committing heinous acts against one another and who had to continue living next to each other. And so that process was like at the skin level. But I think there's a version of that we need to find our way to. I really like the vocabulary that Biden has been using. He's used words like love and the soul, which aren't really political terms, but I've often felt that they're better terms than tolerance, better terms than what we usually think of as defining our character or our determination as a group. And so maybe letting some of this stuff get in, maybe it'll be possible somehow. I love the vocabulary of the possible as it applies to art making. In some ways I get to write a poem and go up into that space. But I'm really curious about what it looks like in the nuts and bolts, and how it gets actually sold to people who are voting.
One of the most infuriating and saddening images from the past few weeks were the pictures of men carrying Confederate flags inside the Capitol building, which was such a desecration. And it made me think of your 2018 collection, Wade in the Water, where you have this whole section of poems that are taken only from the letters that Black Union troops or their family members wrote during the Civil War. Did you think about those troops too?
Absolutely. I thought about them. I also thought about like Black senators who were serving the nation during Reconstruction, like Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. And in a lot of ways, what those rioters represented was the very same force that undid Reconstruction, that brought about the rise of the KKK, that perpetuated this sense of this lost cause. And it breaks my heart to think that that's alive at this moment in our nation, and that it will take some work to if it's even possible, and I hope that it is, convince people to let go of the need to restore isn't quite the right word because I don't think it ever existed, but step into a version of dominance, power, and subjugation of others that I think sits at the heart of these goals, the goal of like white supremacy. I think, my generous reading is there are people who feel so disenfranchised that that's the only kind of justice they can imagine. But it's terrifying at the same time. And it's terrifying that not only here, but in other parts of the world, there's this real backlash toward these kinds of movements.
Speaking about communicating across distances, you do have a poem that is specifically called Political Poem in Wade in the Water, and we would like for you to read from that to close us out.
Sure. When I first wrote this poem, it had a different title, and I read it in Washington, D.C. In, I think, December of 2016. And it occurred to me that this was a political poem. Political poem. If those mowers were each to stop at the whim, say, of a greedy thought, and then the one off to the left were to let his arm float up, stirring the air with that wide, slow, underwater gesture, meaning, hello, and you there, aimed at the one more than a mile away to the right. And if he, in his work, were to pause, catching that call by sheer wish, and send back his own slow, one-armed dance, meaning yes and here, as if threaded to a single long nerve, before remembering his tool and shearing another message into the earth, letting who can say how long graze past until another thought or just the need to know might make him stop and look up again at the other, raising his arm as if to say something like still and oh, and then to catch the flicker of joy rise up along those other legs and flare into another bright yes that sways a moment in the darkening air. Their work would carry them into the better part of evening, each mowing ahead and doubling back, then looking up to catch sight of his echo, sought and held in that instant of common understanding. The God and speed of it coming out only after both have turned back to face the sea of yet and slow. If they could, and if what glimmered like a fish were to dart back and forth across that wide, wordless distance, the day, though gone, would never know the ache of being done. If they thought to, or would, or even half wanted, their work, the humming human engines pushed across the grass, and the grass, blade after blade assenting, would take forever. But I love how long it would last.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Listeners, we encourage you to pick up Wade in the Water or any of Tracy's other award-winning collections.
Thanks so much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me.